Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Canada 24 Press. So much has been happening in Canada recently. The political crisis, the US tariff threats, the 2024 fall economic statement, and the plummeting Canadian dollar. But today, I'm going to tell you the story of Canada's $1.2 trillion federal deficit. A story that began many years ago. Enough chit-chat. Let's get right to the heart of the matter. First, we need to start with the basics. What exactly is a federal deficit? In simple terms, it's when the government spends more money than it collects through taxes, fees, and other revenue sources. This shortfall doesn't go away. It either adds to the national debt until it's paid off in full, or increases year on year, as is the case in Canada, where it has reached a staggering $1.2 trillion. Think of it like a family budget. If you're spending more than you're earning, you rely on credit. But, unlike a family, a government can issue bonds and print money to keep the system afloat. However, this comes at a cost. Rising interest payments, rising prices, and so on. To put this in perspective, back in 2015, when Justin Trudeau took office, Canada's national debt was around $612 billion, and 9 years after it doubled. How did Canada reach $1.2 trillion? Canada's debt didn't balloon overnight from $612 billion to $1.2 trillion. Several factors contributed to this massive increase. Some of them related to political decisions and other inevitable circumstances. For the purpose of this video, we are going to divide this increase into three parts: the pre-pandemic period, the pandemic period, and the post-pandemic period. But first, let's talk about Canada before 2015. Canada's federal debt has fluctuated significantly throughout history, driven by global crises, economic policies, and government priorities under different prime ministers. Between 1975 and 1987, debt growth surged at over 20% annually due to global economic downturns, rising oil prices, and inflationary pressures. By 1981, the debt crossed $100 billion during Pierre Trudeau's government, which expanded social programs and infrastructure, but faced the challenges of rising interest rates and stagflation, which is an economic condition where high inflation, low economic growth, and high unemployment occur at the same time. The debt doubled to $200 billion by 1985 under Brian Mulroney, largely due to tax cuts, economic recession, and increased military spending during the Cold War. In 1991, the debt surpassed $400 billion, as Mulroney grappled with a global economic slowdown, implementing the Goods and Services Tax, or GST, to stabilize revenues. By 1994, it reached $500 billion under Jean Chrétien, fueled by continued deficits. Chrétien's government shifted to fiscal restraint in the mid-1990s, implementing deep spending cuts and reforming federal-provincial transfers. These measures led to a debt reduction of $105 billion between 1997 and 2008, with the debt dropping to $457.6 billion by the end of Chrétien's tenure and Paul Martin's leadership. The 2008 global financial crisis under Stephen Harper reversed this trend, adding over $150 billion in new debt to stabilize Canada's economy through stimulus packages, bailouts, and tax cuts. By 2015, the debt reached $612 billion, but Harper managed to balance the budget with a projected $1.4 billion surplus. Justin Trudeau's government, elected in late 2015, quickly turned this surplus into a $2.9 billion deficit, illustrating a dramatic shift in fiscal policy. Trudeau's tenure highlights the impact of aggressive spending on debt levels, contrasting with earlier efforts to manage and reduce deficits. So during the pre-pandemic period, on October 19, 2015, the Canadian federal election saw the Liberal Party, led by Justin Trudeau, win 184 seats, allowing him to become the 23rd Canadian Prime Minister. His election campaign focused heavily on revitalizing Canada's economy through targeted investments and middle-class support. He proposed a bold infrastructure plan, committing $125 billion over 10 years to create jobs and modernize public systems. Trudeau also introduced a middle-class tax cut, while increasing taxes on the wealthiest Canadians to promote fairness. Unlike his predecessor's austerity approach, Trudeau embraced running modest deficits to fund these initiatives, with a promise to balance the budget by 2019. But as we too well know, no matter the country, political campaigns are only sweet words you whisper to a girl to seduce her. So, between 2015 and 2019, the federal government increased annual spending on infrastructure, social programs, and initiatives like the Canada Child Benefit. While these programs aimed to stimulate economic growth and reduce inequality, they also pushed the annual deficit from $1 billion in 2015 to over $26 billion by 2019. The pandemic shock. When COVID-19 hit in 2020, Canada, like many countries, entered a new era of measures and austerity. Almost all the nations around the globe had the same reaction to overcome the pandemic period. Some countries adopted alternative approaches during the pandemic that yielded better outcomes than Canada's strict lockdown and border closure strategy. South Korea leveraged mass testing, contact tracing, and targeted quarantines, avoiding nationwide shutdowns and limiting its GDP contraction to just 0.9% in 2020, while maintaining low mortality rates. New Zealand implemented strict early lockdowns and border closures to eliminate the virus, resulting in strong economic recovery with 5.6% GDP growth in 2021 and one of the world's lowest COVID-19 death rates. Germany balanced moderate restrictions with robust healthcare support and fiscal stimulus, achieving a smaller GDP contraction of 4.9% in 2020 while preserving key industries. So to support this decision, the Canadian government implemented massive relief programs like the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, CERB, the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, CEWS, and DEWS, and other supports to prevent economic collapse. These programs alone added over $210 billion to the national debt in 2 years, making up nearly 17% of today's total debt. In addition to that, Canada's credit rating was downgraded from AA to AA+ by Fitch Ratings in June 2020, primarily due to the significant fiscal deterioration caused by pandemic-related spending. Fitch cited the ballooning federal deficit and rising debt levels, which exceeded 115% of GDP at the time, as key factors for the downgrade. This marked the first time in decades that Canada lost its top-tier rating. The downgrade increased borrowing costs for the government as lower ratings signal higher risk to investors, thereby affecting the interest rates Canada pays on its debt. Additionally, it diminished Canada's financial reputation globally, making it less attractive for foreign investment. Domestically, this shift has implications for fiscal policy, pressuring the government to tighten budgets, reduce deficits, and restore confidence among credit agencies and stakeholders. After the pandemic period, after the COVID-19 pandemic, inflation surged due to disrupted supply chains and increased consumer demand, prompting costly government interventions. Interest rate hikes to control inflation raised borrowing costs, with debt servicing now exceeding $40 billion annually. Extended emergency programs like CERB and CEWS, alongside new initiatives in housing, healthcare, and climate, further deepened the deficit. Slower economic growth, exacerbated by labor shortages and an aging population, reduced tax revenues while increasing healthcare and pension costs. Unlike some nations that embraced austerity, Canada maintained high spending levels without structural reforms, highlighting the need for a disciplined fiscal strategy to ensure long-term stability. The role of GDP and debt to GDP ratio. So, how do we measure whether Canada's debt is sustainable? This is where GDP comes in. GDP, or gross domestic product, represents the total value of goods and services produced in the country. A growing GDP can offset debt. For instance, if Canada invests in sectors like technology, green energy, and agriculture, GDP growth could lower the debt-to-GDP ratio even if the absolute debt remains high. However, if GDP stagnates while debt continues to rise, we face a serious economic challenge. What about the current data? The debt-to-GDP ratio is a critical metric. The federal debt-to-GDP ratio in 2023-24 was 42.1%, exactly as forecast in Budget 2024, reflecting stronger than expected economic growth after historical revisions. This ratio for 2024-25 is forecast to decline to 41.9%, also matching Budget 2024 projections. This is a meaningful improvement from 47.2% in 2020-21, at the peak of the pandemic. But in a downside scenario, the deficit would increase by about $6 billion annually on average over the planning horizon. As a result, the federal debt-to-GDP ratio would be expected to rise to 42.8% by 2025-26, before declining to 39.9% by 2029-30. Comparing Canada's deficit to historical debt levels. Canada's fiscal situation today is historic, but not entirely unprecedented. Let's compare. World War II. By the end of Wikitui, Canada's debt-to-GDP ratio was 109%, significantly higher than today. However, post-war economic growth and targeted spending allowed Canada to reduce this ratio to under 30% by the 1970s. 1990s fiscal crisis. In the early 1990s, Canada faced another debt crisis. Debt to GDP peaked at 66%, leading to widespread calls for reform. Under Finance Minister Paul Martin, the government implemented significant spending cuts, balancing the budget by the late 1990s. How does Canada compare to other countries? To understand Canada's fiscal situation better, let's compare it to other countries. Worse than Canada, Argentina. Argentina entered the pandemic with significant economic instability, and poor fiscal management worsened its crisis. Inflation hit an extreme level. Debt to GDP in 2023 was 155.41%, but is drastically decreasing. Now, thanks to Javier Milei's political decision by cutting government ministries, the rate is now 91.47%. Oh, Italy. With one of the highest debt to GDP ratios in the world, over 140%, Italy faces high borrowing costs and sluggish economic growth, although recent policy decisions are bearing fruit, with Italy now outperforming France and Germany. Similar to Canada or United States, the US implemented similar relief measures during the pandemic, leading to trillions in additional debt. Its debt to GDP ratio now exceeds 120%, highlighting the long-term challenges of deficit spending. Oh, United Kingdom. The UK also saw its debt balloon during the pandemic due to furlough schemes and business grants. Like Canada, it faces a balancing act between fiscal discipline and public service funding. Better than Canada, oh Germany. Germany's strong pre-pandemic fiscal position allowed it to absorb COVID-19 spending without significantly increasing its debt to GDP ratio. Its economic recovery is supported by robust manufacturing and export sectors. But since the destruction of Nord Stream 2, Germany is facing a huge storm that is leading to a political crisis for Chancellor Olaf Scholz. Oh, Australia. Australia managed pandemic spending efficiently by focusing on targeted relief. Its relatively low debt levels today highlight the importance of fiscal discipline. What does a $1.2 trillion deficit mean for Canadians? A $1.2 trillion deficit represents more than just a number. It is a significant burden on Canada's economic health and sovereignty, with far-reaching implications for citizens, businesses, and the nation's global standing. High amounts of federal debt may also cause the government to raise taxes in future, which burdens future generations with the cost of past spending. Servicing this massive debt requires Canada to pay more than $40 billion annually in interest, an amount that grows as interest rates rise. The government borrows further each year to cover not only new expenses, but also the repayment of previous loans, often at increasingly higher rates due to global economic shifts, which is called rolling over debt. On a day-to-day level, the deficit affects Canadians through reduced public spending on essential services like healthcare, education, and infrastructure. As funds are redirected to cover debt servicing costs, it places upward pressure on taxes, impacting disposable incomes and consumer spending. For businesses, the growing deficit reduces public investments in innovation and increases competition for resources. The US, benefiting from its close economic ties with Canada, has increasingly acquired Canadian assets in key sectors like technology, natural resources, and real estate, further eroding Canadian ownership and economic independence. Foreign buyers of Canadian debt obligations. The Debt Management Report of 2022-2023 reveals that Canada's federal deficit is primarily held domestically, with about 71% managed by Canadian institutions like banks, pension funds, and private investors. The remaining 29% is owned by foreign governments, international banks, and global investors, including entities from the United States, Europe, and Asia. This dependency raises concerns about sovereignty, as external pressures may influence national economic decisions. Lessons from corporate efficiency. Javier Milei's reforms in Argentina offer a compelling case for applying corporate efficiency to address economic crises. Before his presidency, Argentina grappled with hyperinflation exceeding 100%. unsustainable debt to GDP ratios and systemic fiscal mismanagement. Millei's measures, inspired by corporate strategies, included slashing government ministries from 18 to 8, privatizing inefficient state-owned enterprises, and proposing dollarization to curb inflation. He restructured taxes to incentivize productivity and implemented strict fiscal discipline by cutting subsidies and welfare programs. While these reforms have sparked controversy, early signs of inflation stabilization and cautious investor optimism suggest potential long-term benefits. Canada, facing its own fiscal challenges, can draw lessons from Millei's approach by streamlining bureaucracy, redirecting subsidies to growth industries like green energy, and adopting transparent fiscal management. These strategies demonstrate how bold, efficient governance can stabilize an economy while fostering sustainable growth and safeguarding sovereignty. Chrystia Freeland's statement. In her recent statement, former Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland emphasized the need for fiscal discipline. She acknowledged that the deficit exceeded projections by 50% and called for spending cuts to protect Canada's economic future. But critics argue that these measures don't go far enough to address the root causes of our fiscal challenges. Now, to sum up the situation, the $1.2 trillion question is, what's next? Should we increase taxes, cut spending, or focus on economic growth? These are decisions that will shape Canada's future. And as citizens, it's crucial for us to stay informed since we are and will be the first to be impacted by their decisions. Yet, we ourselves need to get more involved than we already are. Learn about the situation, demand accountability from our leaders, and participate in change. Now, marks the end of this video. It was a pleasure for me to relate this $1.2 trillion story to you. Thanks for watching. If you found this video insightful, please like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth analyses. And don't forget to comment below. What do you think Canada should do to tackle its growing deficit? Let's keep the conversation going. See you next time.